Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about the glycemic index versus the glycemic load versus the adjusted glycemic load and what the difference is between them. Okay, so I'm going to be showing you how to calculate all of these in Google Sheets, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using my personal health data sheet. This is where I record all of my personal health data. I'm going to show you how to do the same. So what is the glycemic index? Well, it's a measure of how high blood glucose rises 2 hours after eating something. So pure glucose or maltodextrin has a glycemic index value of 100. Olive oil has a glycemic index of 0 because it doesn't increase your blood sugar at all because it doesn't have any carbohydrates in it. But something like watermelon might have a glycemic index of 72. Okay, so the higher the number, the greater the increase is in your blood sugar. Okay, so the glycemic index is very important for diabetics, particularly, also people with pre-diabetes, or people who are on a low-carb diet and who are just conscious of their blood sugar increases. Okay, so it's a useful index, but the problem with the glycemic index is that it has one major drawback, and that is it doesn't take into account how much of a food that you're eating. It's just a static number. There's only one number assigned per food. Okay, so that's the problem with the glycemic index. Okay, to solve that problem, what people have done is they've created the glycemic load. So the glycemic load, the difference between that and the glycemic index is that the glycemic load takes into account the total grams of net carbohydrates per serving of the food. Okay, so it's the total amount of net carbs per serving of the food. Okay, so for instance, you're unlikely, let's take watermelon, you're unlikely to eat the entire watermelon. You're more likely to eat a couple slices. Okay, so the glycemic load, to calculate that for a watermelon, you would take the total amount of net carbs in a serving of watermelon, which would be about 11. So you take 11 and you multiply that by 72, and then you divide by 100. So if we took 72 multiplied by the total amount of net carbs per serving of watermelon, which is about 11, and then we divided that by 100, what we get is 7.92. Okay, so that would be the glycemic load for a watermelon, be about 7.92. Okay, so now you might be asking yourself, okay, well, what's the difference between total carbohydrates and net carbohydrates? What is a net carb? Well, a net carbohydrate, the glycemic load takes that into account, because net carbohydrates are, you take the total amount of carbohydrates and you subtract the total amount of fiber in that serving of food. Okay, and the reason we subtract fiber is because fiber slows down the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream. Okay, so it does impact the glycemic response that you're having. Okay, so we have to account for the fiber. Okay, so after so the glycemic load is useful, right? So you're taking into account the total amount. You're taking into account the fiber content in the serving of the food, and you're taking into account the serving size itself, which is important because that can vary. But it does suffer from a flaw as well. Okay, so it's not perfect either. And the reason that the glycemic load isn't perfect is because the glycemic load only looks at how many grams are in a standard serving size of a food. Okay, it doesn't take into account how much of the food you actually ate, right? It's just like how much food generally a person might eat. Okay, now I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I get really hungry, right? I get really hungry and I can eat a ton of food, okay? But according to the glycemic load, whether I eat a ton of food or just one standard serving size of that food is basically the same, right? So if I eat, let's take fig Newtons for example, right? Okay, so fig Newtons, the serving size on a fig Newton is 2 cookies. Okay, 2 cookies. I can eat fig Newtons by the sleeve. I eat like 2 sleeves. That's my serving size. Okay, so but the glycemic load wouldn't change whether I had 2 servings, or I'm sorry, 2 cookies, which is 1 serving, or 2 sleeves. It would still be the same. So that's the major drawback of the glycemic load. It doesn't take that into account. So what I've created is something called the adjusted glycemic load. Okay, so I'm going to show you, I'm going to write out the calculation for this in the description below if you want to follow along. But we're going to run through the calculation here. So the calculation for the adjusted glycemic load is this. We're going to take the total carbohydrates in 100-gram serving size of the food, okay? So the total carbs in 100 grams of that food. Then we're going to divide that number by 100 grams to get the grams of total carbs per 1 gram of the food, okay? So it's the grams of total carb per 1 gram of the food, all right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the total grams of fiber in 100 grams of the food, and we're going to divide that by 100 to get the grams of fiber per 1 gram of food, okay? Then we're going to subtract the grams of fiber per gram of the food from the grams of total carbs per grams of the food to get the net carbs per gram of the food. Okay, so at this point we have the net carbs per gram of the food. All right, then what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the net carbs per gram of the food by the amount of grams of food that you actually ate. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take that number and we're going to multiply that by the glycemic index of the food, and we're going to divide everything by 100. Okay, so I know that was a mouthful. All right, I'm going to take you through a couple examples to show this. Once you figure this out, it becomes super easy. It just sounds really complicated. Okay, we're going to take a look at a couple examples here on my spreadsheet. Okay, so we're going to take a look at buckwheat, for example. Okay, so we're going to go to this row. This is my buckwheat row. Okay, so as you can see, I have all sorts of different food ingredients up in that top row. These are all foods that I eat, and I've already calculated all of the data for these foods. Okay, we're going to take a look at the buckwheat. Okay, so what I did here in this in this cell right here, this is the total amount of carbs per 100 grams of buckwheat. Okay, so we're going to take the total amount of carbs in 100 grams of buckwheat is 35.78. Okay, and we're going to divide that by the 100 grams to get 0.36. All right, so there's 0.36 grams of total carb per gram of buckwheat. Okay, all right. Then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the fiber portion, okay? So there's 5.04 grams of fiber in 100 grams of buckwheat, okay? So we divide 5.04 by 100 to get 0.05. So there's 0.05 grams of fiber in a gram of buckwheat, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the net carb fraction, right? And all that is we're going to take cell N3 and we're going to subtract it by cell N8, okay? So we're taking the total amount of carbs in a gram of buckwheat minus the total amount of fiber in a gram of buckwheat to get the total amount of net carbs in a gram of buckwheat, which is 0.31 approximately. Okay, so 0.31. Then what we're going to do is we're going to multiply that number. So we're going to take 0.31 and we're going to multiply that by the glycemic index of buckwheat, which is about 54. Okay, so we're going to take 0.31, we're going to multiply it by 54. Okay, and then we're going to take that number, we're going to multiply that by how many grams of buckwheat that we ate. Let's say we ate 210 grams of buckwheat, right? So we ate 210 grams of buckwheat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take we're going to go back up here. Okay, so we're going to take, again, we're going to take the net carb fraction. I'm just going to do this right here. We're going to multiply it by the glycemic index, okay, which is 54. We're going to multiply that, scrolling down, by how many grams of the food that we actually ate, which was 210 grams, okay? We're going to close this off in parentheses, and we're going to divide everything by 100, okay, to get an adjusted glycemic load of 35, okay? So this is our adjusted glycemic load, 35. That's the answer, okay, for buckwheat. Okay, let's do another example here. Okay, we're going to go to carrots. Okay, so we're going to scroll back up to carrots, okay? There are 9.6 grams of total carbohydrates in 100 grams of a carrot, okay? So we divide 9.6 by 100 to get the total carbs per gram of carrot, all right, which is about 0.1 approximately. Then we have to calculate the fiber part. So we take, there's 2.8 grams of fiber in 100 grams of carrot. So we divide 2.8 by 100 to get 0.03 grams of fiber in 100 grams of carrot, okay? Then we subtract 0.03 from 0.1 to get a net carb fraction of 0.07. So there's 0.07 net carbohydrates in a gram of carrot, in 1 gram of carrot, okay? So we take this number, we multiply it by the glycemic index. For carrots, it's about 45. Glycemic index number is about 45. And let's assume that we ate 47 grams of carrot, okay? So that's, let's just say hypothetically, we consume about 47 grams of carrot, okay? So to calculate the adjusted glycemic load, what we're going to do is we're going to hit equals, okay, we're going up here, equals the net carb fraction multiplied by the glycemic index of the carrot multiplied by how many grams of the carrot that we consumed, which was 47 grams. We're going to wrap that in parentheses, okay? And then we're going to divide everything by 100. We get a adjusted glycemic load of 1, okay? The adjusted glycemic load of 1. Now, okay, so now let's talk about this. So we went ahead, we've calculated both of those, right? So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, what's considered low, medium, and high for the adjusted glycemic load? What are the brackets for this metric? Okay, well, when we take a look at the unadjusted glycemic, so your traditional glycemic load, what is commonly referred to as low is anything that's below 10 is considered low. So if a food has a glycemic load of anything less than 10, it's considered low. If it has a glycemic load between 11 and 19, it's considered like medium. So it's kind of like in that middle bracket. And then anything over 20 is considered high. Okay, so those are kind of like the 3 tiers for the glycemic load. Now, the adjusted glycemic load, a good starting place is to compare it to a traditional glycemic load, right? So, so we can see that 35, obviously that's above 20. So if this was the traditional glycemic load, that's that's really high. That's almost like 2 times the height limit for buckwheat. And that's because buckwheat doesn't have a lot of fiber and it has kind of a high glycemic index, right? So we would hope to see that this would be accounted for, and 35 does reflect that, right? Now keep in mind that the glycemic load is based on established serving sizes, right? So a lot of times what you'll find is that companies are going to set unrealistically small serving sizes because they want to hide how much fat and sugar is actually in the food, right? So that you're more likely to buy it and you're less likely to feel bad about yourself, right? So they set the serving size unrealistically low. So you got to keep that in mind. So, processed food, your adjusted glycemic load is almost always going to be higher than a traditional glycemic load, right, for processed food, because it takes into account how many grams you actually ate versus how many grams they're kind of hoping that you ate. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is it varies widely. What's considered a good quote unquote adjusted glycemic load is going to depend on what kind of person you are. Are you a prepubescent Mongolian girl, in the plains of Mongolia eating buckwheat versus are you, a 25-year-old male bodybuilder who's trying to bulk, for a competition or something. The amount of buckwheat that you're going to consume is going to be incredibly diverse across that range, right? So you got to keep in mind, if you're a bodybuilder, you might have a very high adjusted glycemic load, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just taking into account who you are and how much you need to eat. Maybe you need a really high number versus, if you're a teenage girl who eats like a bird, you're probably going to get a low number, but maybe you need to increase that, because you're not getting enough calories, right? So it varies widely, so you need to consider that as well. So I hope this video was helpful to you guys. I'm going to include the calculations below in the description so that you can kind of see it and track along. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more great videos. I got so many ideas of videos that I want to create in the future. And yeah, leave any comments with any questions if you have them, and I'll be happy to answer those. Okay, thank you guys very much. I'll see you next time.